चित्तस्य पदेन वाचां मलं शरीरस्य च वैद्यकेन योपाकरोत्तं प्रवरं मुनीनां पतञ्जलिं प्राञ्जलिरानतोऽस्मि अबाहु पुरुषाकारं शङ्खचक्रासिधारिणं सहस्रशिरसं श्वेतं प्रणमामि पतञ्जलिं। हरिः ॐ। वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णं वन्दे जगद्गुरुं। सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दुग्धा गोपालनन्दनः पार्थो वत्सः सुधीर्भोक्ता दुग्धं गीतामृतं महत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। In our previous class of the Bhagavad Gita, when we studied the 9th shloka of the 4th chapter, which is on page number 73 of this small book, someone who understands the divine essence of the birth of the birthless entity and the meaning of the actions of the entity which transcends all actions, such a person, mameti, he comes to me. He attains me, he reaches me. This is the shloka, this is the 9th shloka that we discussed, we studied in our previous class. The word I, me is being used quite frequently within this 9th shloka and some of the next few shlokas, because Krishna is talking about himself. What does this his self really mean? When we think of his self, when we think of him, we think of his name, we think of his form, we think of his personality. This is what we understand when Krishna refers to him. But Krishna's understanding of himself is radically different. He is not identifying with that name, with that form, with that physical entity, but he identifies, his identification is with the very core of his personality, with the very core of his being, which in his understanding is, in his experience, is one and the same with all, one and the same with everybody else. So when he uses the word me, when he uses the word I, he refers to that universal essence which is present within him. I remember my master, my teacher, when I was studying the Bhagavad Gita, and when these words used to come, especially in the 7th chapter, where every verse has the word I in it. Every verse in the 7th chapter. There is not a single verse, an exclusion in which the word I has not been mentioned. And he used to emphasize a lot on not getting deluded by what the meaning of this word I is. And he often used to tell a story that a child, very young, 4 or 5 years old, has just learned at school to read and write, and one line that the child has written on that day's class was, "This is my head." A very simple line, "This is my head." When in the evening the child comes back and the father asks, "What did you learn today? What did you study today?" The child opens the book and says, "Read this. This is my head." "What does it mean, son?" "It means this is master's head." Then the father says, "No, beta, this is not master's head. What is written is, this is my head." The child says, "Okay." After a while, the mother asks the same question, "Beta, what did you study today?" Again the same line. "Mother, I studied, this is my head." "Beta, what does it mean?" "It means this is my papa's head." It continues till a guest comes and he asks the same question. And that is when the child really gets confused and said, "My teacher said it is his head, my father said it is his head, and my mother said it is her head. Whose head after all is it?" We might be laughing very easily at the child's ignorance, but when religious scriptures, because in every religious scripture, look at the Quran, for example, it is filled with this first person reference, I. The Vedas are filled with this first person reference. Many of the sacred scriptures, if not all, but many of them, Jesus Christ very often refers to himself. And every time we hear this word, even though we are laughing at, and it is so evident in the case of this story, that every time what the meaning of that word has to be understood in a specific context, it refers to everybody, and on the other side it refers to no one in particular. The same has to be understood when we come across the word I in texts like the Bhagavad Gita. If what comes to our mind is just remains completely limited by the personality of Krishna, then we have done the same mistake that the child does. Because ultimately, The word I is a sarvanama. Aham in Sanskrit, asmad is a sarvanama, is a name of everybody and refers to the very core, to the very essence that is present within every individual. Devoid of all limitations, and because it is devoid of all limitations, there is nothing to create a difference, and hence it is one and the same. So when Sri Krishna speaks Mameti, he unites with me, he is identifying with that universal I, with that universal ego, and not a limited sense of ego. And it is with that universal ego that the meditator identifies and unites. In that sense, the meditator, the one meditating, becomes united, reaches, attains that I. This is what Krishna said. And the union occurs when there is no separation. And the separation, I said, what separates are the limiting qualities. If you remember our discussions that we had when we were studying the Upanishads, Upadhi, the limitations. The moment a person, in this room you can have 100 pots, and within these 100 pots there would be 100 spaces. They would be different from each other as long as the individual limitation of these pots exists. Get rid of these 100 pots, you have one single space, united, which is one and the same. So what separates are those limiting qualities. And once a person transcends, goes beyond with his mind of these limiting qualities, then the walls that separate, the walls of separation get transcended, the walls of separation get removed. These are the same walls that separate us not from everybody else, but also separate us from ourselves. They also separate us from the very core of our being, which is ever present, yet because of these walls of separation, we are neither present, we are neither aware of its presence within our own self, nor we retain an awareness of its presence in everybody else. And one of the biggest reasons which creates this separation, which is caused by this forgetfulness, and which further strengthens, deeply strengthens this forgetfulness, is our greed, our selfishness, our constant coloring of the mind by external objects. This is what Krishna is going to discuss now in the next shloka. Let us first pronounce the next shloka and then we will study it. Vita, 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 Raga, 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 Bhaya, 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 Krodha, 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 Manmaya, 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 Mamupashritaha, 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 Bahavo, 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 Dhyana tapasa, Dhyana tapasa, Dhyana tapasa, Puta, 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 Madbhavam, Madbhavam, madbhavam agataha 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 vitaragabhayakrodha manmaya mamupashritaha bahavo jnana tapasa puta madbhavamagataha. Vita raga bhaya krodha. Someone, the ones from whom raga, let us for the time being translate it as attachment, from whom attachment, fear and anger, these three have naturally fallen away. This is what vita means, fallen away. This shloka is essentially about the last few limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. Vita, by the word, in the word Vita Raga Bhaya Krodha, the very essence of Pratyahara is hidden. The very essence of Pratyahara. Because in the understanding of yoga, Pratyahara, drawing back of the senses, does not only mean to draw back one's senses, which means not experiencing objects anymore. But in the deepest sense, Pratyahara is to experience sense objects without judging them. Which means without whatever experiences come in one's life, without being affected by it, without feeling selfish attachment towards something that is pleasurable, which will lead to suffering when it ceases to exist, and also the capacity to save oneself from the internal feeling of hatred, dislike, anger towards an object which causes discomfort or problems in one's life. This inner strength which enables a person to remain in equilibrium, retain that samatva, retain that sameness in both extremes. That is ultimately what Pratyahara, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, the fifth limb after Pranayama, the next one, stands for. So by these words, Vitaraga Bhaya Krodhaha, Shri Krishna is pointing out the very essence of Pratyahara. And then Mamupashritaha, someone who has allowed his mind to completely depend on me, take refuge in me. This, in a way, talks about the essence of dharana. Dharana in which a person focuses his mind completely on a chosen single object. So that is dharana. And the word before Mamupashritaha, Manmayaha, he is completely absorbed in me. This is dhyana. This is meditation. To be absorbed in me, to be absorbed that contentless inner consciousness, Manmayaha, to be completely absorbed in that. That is Manmayaha. So that is dhyana, that is meditation. And it is this austerity which is not a kind of demonic austerity in which a person inflicts a lot of pain and suffering over his being, but he is working hard to cultivate this wisdom, this understanding, this knowledge. So knowledge this is a kind of austerity which is filled with understanding, not blind austerity, not the kind of austerity that Buddha encountered in his time when he was traveling throughout India and got disillusioned by the extremes which were being taken by some of those that he encountered, which he thought was completely crazy. So not that kind of blind austerity, but austerity which contains deep understanding within it. Dhyana tapasa, with such austerity, when someone is purified, putaha, completely. And when we speak of purification, in the context of yoga, in the context of meditation, it is always about getting rid of agitating thoughts, getting rid of ideas that cause agitation, that cause disturbance in an individual's mind. So Bhagavad Dhyana tapasa putaha, purified by these distracting thoughts, by the hindrances, by the 9 hindrances that Patanjali lists in the Yoga Sutras. Bhagavad Dhyana tapasa puta madbhavamagataha, they reach the very essence, they attain the very state of being. Bhava means being, and my being, the being of that pure contentless consciousness with which Sri Krishna identifies. That being, that state of being, this would be samadhi. So each word in this shloka points out some of the final stages. Of course, asana and pranayama, these 2 stages, Sri Krishna will talk about them in a little bit later. He will talk about pranayama a little bit later in this chapter, and he will talk about asana only in the 6th chapter. He will talk about asana in the 6th chapter. Here in the 4th chapter, in this shloka, he talks about these various aspects of Ashtanga Yoga. A little bit later on, when he will describe sacrifices, he will also describe pranayama. So coming back to this first word, vitaraga bhayakrodha, what do we mean by the word raga? The word often comes, it is very often used. What does it really mean? Attachment, as has been translated, does not really catch the meaning of the whole word, because raga has to do with colors. Raga means coloring. Raga means to be completely colored in the color of the object of perception. That is what the word raga very literally, when our thoughts get completely colored, and when the thing about this coloring is when it occurs on the mental level, because when you have, if your glasses are green or if your glasses are purple, then it doesn't matter however transparent the light is, however clear the weather out there is, you will see everything green, you will see everything red. Because if that coloring is present, whatever a person might do, that coloring will come up. So if there is some coloring in one's thoughts, that coloring will come up in everything that we think in. In our decision, we might think that our decision is completely logical. What we are thinking is completely logical. What we are seeing is completely out there. But the reality would be that still, knowingly or unknowingly, this is the difference. The mind has this nature to get colored. Somehow, a person practicing meditation can cultivate this awareness, and even if the mind gets colored, He can analyze the mind content minus that coloring, which is only someone who works with his mind can achieve. Otherwise, an animal follows its instincts. The moment an instinct comes up, the moment its mind gets colored by any particular desire, it has no way to detach itself, to get a third person's view and detach itself internally from that coloring and do something else. The animal can't do it. It just, whenever that coloring occurs, it just does it. It just follows it. The human, to some extent, has that capacity intrinsically, and it can be developed even further. A practitioner of meditation, this is what he does. And vairagya, which we so easily translate as detachment, lack of attachment, or sometimes people even misunderstand it as hatred or aversion towards object, or what all they understand by the word vairagya. Vairagya simply means to go beyond that coloring. Viraga, someone who has reached, who has transcended above that coloring. Such a person is called viraga, and the state of such a person is called vairagya. And these two things, practice and vairagya, on the path of yoga, on every step, these two are like the two legs on which we walk, are like the two wheels on which we ride. They are like the two wings which a bird requires to fly. A bird cannot fly with one wing. We cannot easily walk with one leg. A bicycle to ride with one wheel would be extremely difficult. It is these two things, detachment and practice, which help a person to develop on this path. That is why in the very beginning of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali speaks of, after he has defined yoga, yogaschitta vritti nirodha, how is yoga acquired? Then he says, abhyasa and vairagya. Abhyasa vairagya abhyam tan nirodha. Constant practice and vairagya. A constant effort to transcend coloring. Effort, practice is what takes us ahead, and vairagya is what protects us from falling back. And if you want to pump up water, you require two things. You require both. You require the energy to pump it up, but if you don't have a valve, and in our body there are so many valves, our blood would not journey through our body. It would not proceed, it would not advance into all these different parts of our body if there would be no valves. These valves have to close so that the blood does not fall back. And like this, continues to travel further and further. The same concept is achieved through practice and through vairagya. Vairagya, the transcending that coloring. And that coloring comes up in various ways. One of the most important ways is the most illogical one, and yet it is the most common one which we fail to detect. The desire that a pleasurable object may not be destroyed, may not get destroyed. Yet It is illogical because everything that has been created, everything that has been produced will be destroyed at some point. And to analyze this and to understand it is important because that object of our pleasure will at some point get destroyed, and in our coloring it becomes very difficult to get rid of that coloring, and because of that, then when the object, according to the natural principles, when it gets removed or when it's taken away by somebody else due to the principle of karma, or when it gets destroyed due to our coloring in its absence, we suffer. That leads to suffering. That even if it does not get removed, it certainly leads to the second thing what Krishna speaks of, bhaya, fear. All our fears are frightened. All our fears are present only because of that coloring. Deep down we fear because of these colorings that are there. And a yogi in meditation analyzes that. He analyzes his mind content. He goes into the very root of his fears and he finds these colorings, and then he has to find a way to free himself. And this way is not somewhere out there. The light of yoga is to be found within. The solution is to be found within. When a person perseveres, when a person is persistent, when a person tries to introduce this inherent change with awareness, with cultivating awareness, with becoming aware of it. The moment we become aware of a problem, we have already taken a step towards its solution. If we don't take that step, then ultimately this coloring and this fear leads us to the final and most drastic, most harmful step, which is krodha, which is hatred, which is anger. Everything that we see, all the problems that we see in today's world can only be traced back to anger, to this hatred. So through these three successive stages, coloring, fear, and then anger, Sri Krishna gives us a way, a method, something to meditate upon, something to analyze. If anger comes up, if there is anger within us, let us meditate on it. Let us analyze it. Let us look at the fear that gives rise to that anger, and then analyze that fear and try to find the coloring which gives rise to that fear, and then ultimately get rid of that coloring. This is one of the first steps that someone who is practicing meditation, simply trying to focus his mind again and again on a chosen object, works for a while, but at some point someone would have to face himself, and he would have to work with himself. He would have to work with his mind content. He cannot run away from it. He cannot escape it. And this word is about that. And it is only after someone has perfected himself in this, has analyzed himself in this, then the next words, after the mind content has been made clean, that taking refuge in that omnipresent consciousness, becoming united with it, becoming completely absorbed in it, all these concepts start making sense. Because ultimately it is this coloring. What makes the crystal, a colored crystal, if we go back to our example of the upadhi, where because of the Chinese rose hibiscus, in the presence of hibiscus, when the crystal assumes that red color, what is in that crystal which creates a difference between this piece of crystal that lies in the presence of this hibiscus flower and the original crystal which is there, which is its source, which lies at the very core of this earth? What is different? The only thing is different, that upadhi, that coloring. That is the only thing which is making it different from that. If it gets rid of that coloring, if it frees itself from that coloring, if it allows that coloring, which was not its inherent nature, which was not intrinsic natural nature, but was taken from something else, the moment it frees itself from that coloring, then it is already united, one and the same, becomes the very natural statement. It's not something that has to be achieved, that has to be acquired. It becomes the very essence. So raga, in this sense, is about this coloring. Now, Vita raga bhayakrodha manmaya mamupashritaha, like this manmayaha completely absorbed in me, and mamupashritaha, someone who has taken refuge in me, someone who has taken me as his only support, no other object anymore, but just that contentless pure consciousness, not an object, but the subject itself. No more anything witnessed, but the witness itself. Someone who has taken refuge in the witness itself. When the world around us becomes engrossed in turmoil, we take refuge where we find peace. And when we realize that this is the inner abode of supreme peace, it becomes very natural for us to take refuge in this inner center where there is no turmoil, no agitation, but that which transcends all agitations. Bahavo dhyana tapasa. Once again, the austerity of wisdom, the austerity that contains awareness, the austerity which contains mindfulness. Mindfulness itself is the greatest austerity. To be mindful, to be aware of this presence, to be ever aware, to be perpetually aware of it, not momentarily, but to be ever aware of that. What does tapas mean? We often use the word, and we have often discussed it. Any practice which helps us to cleanse inner impurities. And what greater purifying agent there can be than mindfulness? Than what Patanjali calls smrityupasthana, the rising of mindfulness, what Buddha calls satipatthana, the rise of mindfulness, the rise of awareness in everything that is happening in the mind, to become a witness of that, to become aware of it. Because it is everything that comes, every emotion actually can only color us and can only color our mind when we become negligent, when we lose this mindfulness, when we lose this awareness. That is when these emotions, these strong emotions, they are capable of coloring us. So tapas, as I said earlier, devoid of understanding. There is a beautiful saying in the Upanishads that vidyaya tada ruhanti. It is only through understanding that a person ascends to the state in which transcends the limited desires, the fulfillment of limited desires, Na vidvansas tapasvinaha. Unfortunately, those who perform austerity without understanding, they don't achieve it. They don't acquire it. They don't reach there. And therefore, when we talk of tapas, then ultimately it is self-analysis. These 5 questions that are often should be asked. Koham, who am I? Moksha katham, how will I find freedom from this coloring, from ignorance, which is the ultimate coloring, from this forgetfulness, from this negligence? How will I be able to free myself? To ask oneself this question: for what reason I am here in this human body? To ask this question. Many times when we are engrossed with so many meaningless tasks in our life, if this question would come up into our mind and we just stop for a few moments and think, why am I here? Am I here to do this? Am I here to cheat others? Am I here to deceive others? Am I here to inflict suffering on others? Is this the purpose that I'm here? Or is this the way to free myself from this forgetfulness? Is this really what I am? If we would keep on asking this, if we would make this our very nature to ask these questions, Goham, who am I? How I will acquire freedom from this darkness, and for what reason? What is ultimately the purpose, so that we have a very clear goal in perspective and see everything in perspective of that. With this awareness, this is what Sri Krishna understands by dhyana tapas. And not only that, when also the word tapas is used, tapas is also deeply related to make a constant effort. The word ashrama, which we hear so often in Rishikesh and Haridwar, there are hundreds and thousands of ashrams. The word ashram actually designates a place where people can come together and make an effort. Make an effort, a physical effort, a pranic effort, and a mental effort. Effort on every level. Effort on the level of the physical body, effort on the level of speech, effort on the level of prana, effort on the level of the mind. The very grammatical meaning of the root shram, shramu tapasi khedecha. Shram means tapas. Shram and tapas, these roots, they are synonyms. They mean the same thing. Ashrama actually means a place to perform austerity. The practice of asana, in which we positively accept a little bit of suffering which is beneficial for us to the extent that we can tolerate it. That is part of that tapas. The discomfort that a person experiences in practices of asana and pranayama, that is tapas. And then most beautifully, when the meaning of the word tapas is explained in the Vedas, then in the context of greed, of which we already talked earlier, raga, attachment, raga, coloring of the senses, coloring the desire to have more. In that context, tapas also means to share with others, in which we have with which we identify very strongly, to share that with others. That is also one of the definitions of tapas. Etat khalu vava tapa yada ityahuhu The masters have called tapas this as well. Yaha swam dadati, in which a person shares with others what is dear to him, what is close to him. He experiences it, he enjoys it after sharing it with others. So this sense of sharing, this is also a form of tapas. So all this, when performed with understanding, if it is performed without understanding, then it is just tapas. But if it is performed with understanding, with keeping the goal in perspective, then it becomes jnana tapasa. So many yogis, O Arjuna, in the past, jnana tapasa putah, after having purified no vice, no impurity, no evil can persist in the face of self-inquiry and mindfulness. Excuse me. Bahavo jnana tapasa putah madbhavam agatah. And it is only after that that a person attains my state of being. So with this, Shri Krishna in this shloka talks about what has happened in the past with many masters. He provides them as an example, as an ideal to Arjuna. Now in the next shloka, the topic of discussion will be extremely beautiful, which we will discuss on next Wednesday, which will tell us why I emphasized so much in the beginning of not misunderstanding what Krishna means by I. Because the beautiful thing is, on the path of yoga, in the teachings of Krishna, in the teachings of the Upanishads, it doesn't really matter what name and form we give for the sake of meditation, for the sake of focusing our attention on that nameless, formless entity. It does not matter what name and what form we give to it to facilitate our mind. What name and form we give to it as a prop, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. And it is this inherent unity, this recognition that lies at the core of every tradition within Hinduism, at least. Otherwise, Shaivism, Shaktism, and Vaishnavism, these three very distinctive streams, are as distinct as Christianity is from Islam, and Islam and Christianity are from Judaism. Radically different. Similarly, like they share the same prophets, yet they are three different religions, Hinduism is not really one religion. Hinduism is an umbrella term. There are various very distinct religions within it, which, as I said, are as distinct from each other as Christianity and Islam are from Judaism and are distinct from each other. Yet each one of them accepts this inherent unity, this inherent oneness behind names and behind forms, and it is for this reason we are capable of treating them as one religion. And I think this is a beautiful model, because it can be applied to every religion, to not only every religion, but to every expression of every valid expression of the truth. And like the x of algebra, which is, because it is a variable, its meaning, its application depends on a particular context. But deep down, what algebra does, it points out the very general rules of mathematics which are universally applicable. In the same way, what Patanjali, what the Upanishads, what Shri Krishna tries to explain are the very fundamental, universal rules which are applicable to every method that a person chooses. That is the beauty, that is the universal nature of these teachings. This is what we will find in the next verse, which corresponds to Patanjali's saying, Yathabhimata dhyanadva, a person finds inner purity by meditating upon whatever he chooses to fix his mind upon, according to his choice. So this idea that is expressed by Patanjali in one of his sutras, Yathabhimata dhyanadva, will be expressed in the next shloka. We will discuss that universal nature in the next class. Any questions? Any thoughts?
So what actually means we should live in choices or we should not live in choices?
What Patanjali means is that initially, to train one's mind, we need to make use of a form as a prop. And however a religion tries to get rid of a form, it still somehow has a form. Islam got rid of human forms, but forms are still there. It still uses symbols, whether it is the written form of Allah, which is found in so many places, whether it is that stone in Kaaba, whether it is Kaaba itself, which is the direction of their prayer. Something tangible initially is required for the mind. So, okay, they chose to get rid of a human form, yet initially it's not possible, because our mind is so deeply conditioned with names and forms that initially, if you have nothing altogether, then for someone meditating there will be nothing altogether. Unless there doesn't arrive this awareness of something in nothing. Unless there does not arise the awareness of the sound that is there in complete silence. The sound of Om is required. A form is required. Our human mind is like that. One can speak so much against rituals as people nowadays do, but only now recently psychologists are becoming aware how important rituals are for the human mind. Initially they become a distraction if a person remains trapped in them, but initially they are tremendously helpful. So the point is that a person at some point has to make a choice, choose that form to, it's just practical, One has to make a choice, one has to choose something. Eventually the idea is to go beyond that form, to go beyond that name. That is there, but the choice has to be made.
But not going from choice to choice.
No. That is again, for example, in someone practicing in the Shaiva tradition, he deeply respects all other forms, but completely focuses on Shiva and no other form. Or he would see other forms just as manifestations of Shiva. If you ask a Shaiva person, he would say Vishnu is just a form of Shiva. In Shaiva traditions, if you go to Indonesia, for example, you see Vishnu meditating with a Shivalinga in his hand on Shivalinga. Because in the understanding of Indonesian Hinduism, which was deeply influenced by Shaivism, mostly altogether, in their understanding, Vishnu is just a form of Shiva. Brahma is just a form of Shiva. In Vaishnava understanding, Shiva is just a form of Vishnu, because their focus is completely on Vishnu. In the Shakta understanding, every Shiva, Vishnu, all these are forms of Shakti. So the complete focus is on Shakti. Now if you look from outside, people get confused. Well, if you ask Shaivas, they say Vishnu is a form of Shiva. If you ask Vaishnavas, they say Shiva is a form of Vishnu. Who is correct? Who are they? That confusion occurs. That confusion occurs when there is a lack of depth. When we don't understand the essence of these names and forms, then confusion arises. If not, then there is no confusion.
I think that's also because many other religions and other cultures tend to cling to their own God.
Yes.
That's why.
That's why.
This is my God.
This is my God. Yes.
How can those people have?
Yeah.
That's why they fight.
That's why they fight.
That one God.
Yeah.
The other gods exist.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
mind is not elastic or open enough
Yeah.
to understand that there is only one God.
Yeah.
Whatever, regardless of the name.
Yeah. There is a beautiful occurrence in Goswami Tulsidas ji's life. Goswami Tulsidas was, I think, the second greatest poet of Hindi literature after Surdas. Surdas was a great devotee of Krishna, and Goswami Tulsidas was a great devotee of Rama. When they met each other, they realized that we have not written about the deity of the other one, which means Surdas, they were both contemporaries. So Surdas realized that he did not write anything about Rama. He only kept on writing about Krishna and never about Rama. Goswami Tulsidas ji realized that he never wrote anything about Krishna. So he asked Surdas to write something about Rama. Surdas did. Surdas asked him to at least visit once Vrindavan and have darshan of Krishna. It is said that Goswami Tulsidas went to Vrindavan, but he said to the divine there that unless you don't take a dhanush ban, which means the arrow and the bow in your hands, Tulsidas will not bow down in front of you, because Tulsidas is completely dedicated to that form alone and no other form. Now, this can be seen as narrow-mindedness. On the other hand, it can be seen as complete focus, that he wants to focus completely altogether, because ultimately it is about ekatattva abhyasa, it is about practicing one essence, it is about focusing oneself on one. But that should not be taken as narrow-mindedness, that should not mean hatred towards others. That is my point.
It seems that these forms and props are just a different colouring.
Yes.
You may argue that they are a better colouring than negative thoughts and taking drugs, whatever, and beating yourself up and being violent, for sure. But to me it seems that they cannot really lead you to enlightenment. You just have a different colouring in your mind.
Yes.
And you cannot, by putting your focus on something and colouring your mind like that, you cannot understand. You cannot become crystal clear. I don't see that there's a missing link for me between the practices and focusing on something good, which is valuable and valid and is definitely a better choice in this life to spend your time with. But there's a missing link for me. How will it lead you to understanding?
Yes. It comes back really to the idea of vritti, of mental happenings. And I would say that there are so many colors. By choosing one color, first of all, we get rid of all the colors. And then, yes, one has to get rid of that coloring as well. Yes, that is part of the practice. That is what Patanjali speaks about. I mean, Patanjali, he speaks about, first of all, focusing one's mind on a tangible object. Then he speaks about the subtle aspect of that object. Then he speaks about shifting one's awareness from the tangible into the subtle, and then from the subtle into the blissful essence of that object, and then ultimately from the blissful essence into the experiencer of that blissful essence. So the shift occurs when a person, first of all, with the help of focusing on one object, a person frees his mind from other object. The shift occurs when a person leaves any object and all objects together and focuses on the witness, focuses on consciousness itself. That is when the shift occurs. That is when a person frees himself even from this coloring that you are talking about. When a person, this coloring is there, yes, in the mind content, this coloring is there, but it leads us, it helps us to become aware of, to strengthen that awareness of the witness, and when that awareness takes over, then even this coloring is transcended. Then, in other words, the very particular form that we have chosen doesn't matter. Then a person has even detached himself. That would be literally what Muhammad did. But Muhammad did it externally to break the statue, to kill the Buddha. Yes, this is what one of the greatest Zen masters in China, he gave this koan, this thought to meditate, that kill the Buddha if you meet him. Destroy him if you meet him. Because the idea is you cannot meet the Buddha, you are the Buddha. So if you meet him, then it is not the Buddha, then it is something else. Get rid of it, break it. So one of the prayers that is there, which so easily we used to parrot out in the beginning of every class at the monastery, Ishvaro Guru Ratmeti, God, Master and myself, the teaching that destroys the murti, the form, which creates a difference between these three, God, Master and myself. The murti, the form that creates the difference between these three, the wisdom that destroys that form, I bow down to that wisdom. So that wisdom which breaks that limited form.
I think you said it beautifully when you said that the two ways to get beyond the coloring, which by the way is a beautiful word, the raga, because it's amazing, because coloring comes to mind even something beautiful. But if you say raga, it doesn't mean beautiful, negative or positive, it's just all types of coloring.
Yeah.
But you said through practice and detachment. So practice is meditation, and the detachment is through self-inquiry.
Yes, detachment is through self-inquiry. Yes, yes, self-inquiry. Yes, yes, yes.
Guruji was using this sutra also from the Yoga Sutras, and so he explained it like this, of course, in connection with asanas. So you're going for Saranasana, and you like it for some time. You like it, you are excited to do Saranasana. Then when you have to stay a little longer in Saranasana, then you don't like it anymore. You start feeling boring. Maybe some pain is coming. Then again you think, okay, now it's enough. So now I do maybe Shirshasana. Again you are excited. Then again staying, if you have to stay a little longer, you get tired out of it like this. So he says, so first of all we have to come out of choices, so not to have different choices. And then of course to, when the pain comes, to have because they're all pain, or feeling boring, they're all the barriers.
The barriers
of the mind,
yes,
which you have to break. So coloring of mind is barriers, it's the same like barriers.
Like a barrier.
Of mind. So he
Yes.
says you have to break the barriers of mind, so for to go to the infinite, for to go deeper.
It's a very practical approach of this into the practice of asana.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because whatever thing or object gives us pleasure, it's just based on some memory. But it's very quick that whatever that memory can go from something pleasurable to something not pleasurable.
It all the time goes from
I mean, even if you love ice cream, it's fine, you like it, but if you eat 100 of them, you're not going to like it anymore. It's not going to make you sick. Yeah, you have to go beyond all of that, you know. Just one quick thing about the rituals you were talking about. It's true that many people seem to sometimes criticize these rituals, but I think you were saying rightly so that rituals are important to people, and I think if we look at it on a daily basis, also habits in people can be a good thing in the beginning. We have certain habits, say the time that we eat, the time that we sleep, and I think this is similar to the rituals in a way that it brings order to the person.
And the whole idea of rituals is to bring order.
Have order inside. I mean, outside you cannot have order inside. But then after that, you become more elastic, and that type of rigidity
needs to get rid of.
For rituals,
yes.
You can go beyond them.
Yes.
But
in Ishavasya Upanishad, towards the end, there is a beautiful discussion how to put rituals and meditation into perspective, and how individually both of them without each other could be detrimental, but when both are practiced together, they benefit, and how they benefit. There is very interesting discussion that we will come.
Yeah, it brings an order into.
Yes.
Not practicing one day, next day.
And you stop and you get lazy and you get bored, and one thing or another, the mind starts to tell you.
Yeah. Then the depth does not come.
The depth does not come.
Yeah. The depth comes when we dedicate wholeheartedly ourselves to it.
So Harkaji, you said there were 5 questions that, if I understood correctly, 5 questions that would be good if we asked ourselves. 5 or 3?
3. Yes. I might have. There were 3. Yes. It's from one of the Puranas, which. Koham katham moksha kena samsaram pratipannavan. Koham, how am I? Katham moksha, how do I acquire freedom from this coloring? Kena samsaram pratipannavan. For what purpose have I come to this have come into this flow of existence? Ityalochanam, to analyze this. Arthajnah, those who know the essence, they call it tapaha shamsanti pandita. They call it tapas. This analysis of 3 kinds, they call it tapas.
So these 3 questions we can put on ourselves also when we do our practice.
Yes, whatever we do, it should be part of our life. In everything we do, we can ask these questions. Who am I? What is my true identity? What am I doing? Why I am doing it? It's always helpful.
Because we don't know.
Okay. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत् ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः